You are listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For today's episode, I had the opportunity to interview Barbara D'Amato. Barbara, who has decades of experience as a psychoanalyst, is the author of the psychological fiction novel Triskele. I'm here with Dr. Barbara D'Amato. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
Yes, perfectly fine, yes.
And Dr. D'Amato is the author of the novel Triskele. Did I pronounce the name of the novel correctly?
Triskele. The final E is silent. Triskele.
Triskele. Dr. D'Amato, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Okay. Well, I'm a psychoanalyst. I've been in practice probably for over 30 years. And I listen to lots of stories from lots of people. And I do enjoy writing. So I've written many professional papers. But Triskele is my first novel, my first work of fiction. And it's a work about a psychoanalyst and some of the ways that psychoanalysis works, but it's completely fictionalized.
Now, without spoiling too much of Triskele, what is your book about?
Well, it's mainly about three characters who are really looking to find grace. And what that means is they're looking for some kind of self-acceptance or some kind of redemption for whatever's happened to them in their lives. And they randomly meet up in this book, and they have a very strong impact upon each other. And they bring something to each other that they're all looking for. Of course, they don't know they're going to find these people, and they don't even really know what it is they're looking for. But something's driving them to find some kind of peace in their lives that up until now they have not been able to find. So it's a deeply psychological story.
And did anything other than your experience with the treating patients as a psychoanalyst lead to your writing of the book?
Actually, there was. I was preparing for a conference, and I was writing up a case that I was going to present. And it was a case I had worked with for quite some time, about 20 years. And it was so interesting to me to see the development of the patient's character and how they got better and how they struggled with various conflicts they were having. And I thought, this is such fun writing up about one person and just sort of following an arc of their life, where they came from, where they got stuck, and what they moved on to. And I thought I should write a novel. And that's kind of where the idea started.
Now, as your book has three main characters instead of one, how difficult is it to write a novel with three main characters instead of one?
It's a good question, because it's actually probably easier. I mean, Freud says that in a dream, every character is an aspect of the person who's dreaming. So if we extrapolate that, we could say that every character in a novel, or at least certainly in my novel, is some piece of myself. So I think some piece of myself, the author, was actually reflected in each one of these characters to greater or lesser degrees. So somehow, in a sort of very metaphorical way, they were all part of one person. That's one way to look at it. So this person sort of was very promiscuous. This person was very self-depriving. The other person was very filled with guilt about various things. So it all they just sort of played off each other. And in that way, they were very therapeutic to each other, not realizing it until they were involved in relationships together.
Is Triskele self-published or traditionally published?
It's traditionally published by Atmosphere Press, and it was published in March of this year. And it was a very good publication company. I had a very good experience with them. So I've enjoyed that journey of getting it published, which is very different than publishing nonfiction, because I've written professional papers before. It's a very different experience.
Okay, what is the biggest adjustment you had to make from publishing professional papers to publishing a novel?
Well, I think for me as a psychoanalyst, in treating patients, the analyst really doesn't reveal themselves. We're largely silent and largely listening and reflecting back to the patient and answering questions. So in writing a novel, I really felt like I was exposing a lot of myself that I was not necessarily even conscious of at the time. So that was really the biggest challenge, to put this out into the world, and for people who might be my patients or people who might have worked with me in various other ways, to see this sort of exposure of myself that professional writing as a psychoanalyst did not expose me to at all.
Now, do you plan on writing more books in the future?
I do. I'm working on another novel that's called Keys to the Castle, which is a very kind of different story. It's not quite as dark. I think I got all of my dark demons out in this first novel. The next book is going to have a little bit more of magic in it, something more of Celtic mythology in it.
Now, prior to writing Triskele, you mentioned this a couple of times, but you wrote multiple professional papers analyzing the psychic conflicts of literary characters and their authors. An example was Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was the example I was going to cite, and I thought I was going to mix up a couple literary works there, but fortunately,
nope, you got it right.
But
you got it right.
The question I've got is, what was the most difficult part of I kind of asked a similar question. This is kind of worded a little bit different, but what was the most difficult part of transitioning from writing professional papers to writing a work of fiction?
I have to say, it was not exactly difficult. It was easier, because when you're writing a professional paper, you have to back up everything you have with references and research and fact, and you don't want to contradict what, the ideas that are in the field unless you can back them up with various data. When you're writing fiction, you can write whatever you want. I could go anywhere I wanted to go. It was so liberating, which is why I think I wanted to do it. I mean, after finishing a doctorate and doing really serious research and writing numerous papers, this was sort of like, wow, this is really a lot of fun.
Okay, and the last question I have is, what do you enjoy most about your work as a psychoanalyst?
I think I enjoy seeing what gets in people's way. People, when they're living their lives, we build up defenses that keep us from doing things that we really want to do, or that cause us to do self-destructive things that we really don't want to do. For example, parents might tell a child, you need to be a doctor. And the kid goes to medical school and finds out, I don't want to be a doctor. This isn't what I want. So someone like that, if they were in treatment, they would sort of start thinking about, what do I really want? Who am I really underneath this? I followed this journey that wasn't mine. Someone else had sort of prescribed it for me. And I think a lot of people fall into those categories to a greater or lesser degree, where they're not following who they really want to be. And I think working with patients, you can see, I mean, it takes time. It's not easy. It's a long, slow process. But people can, over time, as they keep talking about their lives and themselves, they can get to who they really are and what they really want. And that's enormously gratifying to see that.
Yeah, well, Barbara, that was my final question, and I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author Podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I hope the Zoom wasn't too taxing for you.
No, it wasn't.
Very good.
That was one of the shortest interviews I've ever done for this podcast, but great things sometimes come in small packages. In this case, a small package at a time, and it was wonderful to be able to interview Barbara. Her work as a psychoanalyst and now as an author is fascinating, and I hope to be able to read Triskele soon. While I have an opportunity, I'll mention that the Heartland Author channel on YouTube will be returning with new videos after the Labor Day holiday here in the United States. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at AuthorAAC and on Instagram at AACScribe. Copyright 2023, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.